Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 32 of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. In the last chapter, we saw Elizabeth showing off her skills by walking on her fingertips in front of Mr. Darcy, who arrived at Lady Catherine's place with his friend, Colonel Fitzwilliam. And meanwhile, Elizabeth is just teasing Darcy and entertaining Colonel Fitzwilliam and just kind of poking fun. So it's interesting. It's fun. I like it. We'll see where it goes. Anyways, welcome to Chapter 32, everyone. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning, meditating, while Mrs. Collins and Maria were gone on business into the village, when she was startled by a ring at the door. She had heard no carriage. She thought it unlikely to be at Lady Catherine, and under the apprehension was extinguishing her incense when the door opened, and to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy entered the room. He seemed astonished, too, on finding her alone, and apologized for his intrusion by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies were to be within. They then sat down, while and when her inquiries after Rosings were made, seemed in danger of sinking into total silence. As they often do, because Darcy doesn't know how to talk to people, because he's too full of himself, you know? That's what the last chapter was about. It was absolutely necessary, therefore, to think of something, and in this emergency recollect when she had seen him last in Hertfordshire. And feeling curious to know what he would say on the subject of their hasty departure, she observed, "How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It should have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon, for, if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?" "Perfectly so, I thank you." She found that she was to receive no other answer, and after a short pause added, "I think I understood that Mr. Bingley has not much of an idea of ever returning to Netherfield again." I've never heard him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in the future. He is rather afraid of zombies, and their numbers in that part of the country are continually increasing. If he means to be but little at Netherfield, it would be better for the neighborhood that he should give up the place entirely, for then we might possibly get a settled family there, with one with a keener interest in the deadly arts. But perhaps Mr. Bingley did not take the house so much for the convenience of the neighborhood as for his own, and we must expect him to keep it or quit it on the same principle. "I should not be surprised," said Darcy, "if he were to give up as soon as it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers." Elizabeth made no answer. She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and, having nothing else to say, she was now determined to leave the trouble of finding a subject to him. He took the hint, and soon began with, "This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford." "I believe she did, and I'm sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object." "Mr. Collins appeared to be very fortunate in his choice of wife." Elizabeth detected hesitation in his compliment. Was he sensible of Charlotte's being stricken? "Yes, indeed, his friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him or may have made him if they had." I don't know if you saw that, but there was a little fly. I don't know how it got in here, but my friend has an excellent understanding, though I am not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the weirdest thing she ever did. This is Elizabeth, I think. "She seems very perfectly happy. However, in a prudential light, it is certainly a very good match for her. It must be very agreeable for her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own family and friends." "An easy distance, do you call it? It is nearly 50 miles. "And what is 50 miles of zombie-free road? Little more than half a day's journey. Yes, I call it a very easy distance." "I should have never considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match," cried Elizabeth. "I should have never said that Mrs. Collins was settled near her family." "It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighbourhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far." As he spoke, he let slip a sort of smile which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing to her thinking of Jane and Netherfield, as she blushed as she answered, "Sir, you forget that I have twice made the journey to the darkest reaches of the Orient, a journey you know to be frightfully long and fraught with bears." "Bears!" "I assure you, my picture of the world is a rather a bit bigger than Longbourn. However, Mr. and Mrs. Collins have never had a need of embarking on such adventures, so I suspect their ideas of the distance are much like those of other ordinary people. I am likewise persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance. Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her. Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing over it, said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with the news from Sheffield?" A short dialogue on the subject of the army's recent victory ensued, on either side calm and concise, and soon put an end to by the entrance of Charlotte and her sister, just returning from a walk. The tete-a-tete surprised them. Mr. Darcy related the mistake which had occasioned his intrusion on Miss Bennet, and after sitting a few minutes longer without saying much to anybody, went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" howled Charlotte as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, what must be of you? I never would have called in this familiar way." She does not sound good. I'm just trying to read it how it's written. But when Elizabeth told of his silence, it did not seem very likely, even to Charlotte's wishes, to be the case, and after various conjectures, they could at last only suppose his visit to proceed from the difficulty of finding anything to do, which was the more probable from the time of years. The ground was quite frozen, and neither fresh unmentionables nor field sports would be seen again until spring. Within doors there was Lady Catherine, books, and a billiard table, but gentlemen cannot always be within doors, and in the nearness of the parsonage, or the pleasantness of the walk to it, or of the people who lived in it, the two cousins found a temptation from this period of walking thither almost every day. They called at various times of the morning, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and now and then accompanied by their aunt. It was plain to them all that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he had the pleasure in their society, a persuasion which of course recommended him still more. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage, it was more difficult to understand. It could not be for his society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips, and when he did speak, it seemed to the effect of necessity rather than choice. He seldom appeared really animated, even at the sight of Mrs. Collins gnawing upon her own hand. Jeez. What remained of Charlotte would likely to have believed this change the effect of love, and the object of that love her friend Eliza. She watched him whenever they were at Rosings, and whenever he came to Hunsford, but without much success, for her thoughts often wandered to other subjects, such as the warm, succulent sensation of biting into a fresh brain. Mr. Darcy certainly looked at her friend a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there was much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but absence of mind. And upon imagining Mr. Darcy's mind, her thoughts were again turned to the subject of chewing on his salty, cauliflower-like brain. She had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his being partial to her, but Elizabeth always laughed at this idea, and Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press the subject, from the danger of raising expectations which might only end in disappointment. In her kind schemes for Elizabeth, she sometimes planned her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. He was beyond comparison the most pleasant man. He certainly admired her, and his situation in life was most eligible. But, to counterbalance these advantages, Mr. Darcy had a considerably larger head, and thus more brains to feast upon. Chapter 33. More than once did Elizabeth, in her ramble within the park, unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. She felt all the perverseness of the mischief that should bring him where no one else was brought, and, to prevent its ever happening again, took care to inform him at first that it was a favourite haunt of hers. How it could occur to the second time, therefore, was very odd. Does it? Because it seems like he wants to be there. Yet it did, and even a third. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or listening very much. But it struck her to the course of their third rencontre that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, which bones she had broken, and her opinion of the suitability of marriage for warriors such as they. She was engaged one day as she walked in pursuing Jane's last letter and dwelling on some passages which proved that Jane had not written in spirits, when, instead of being again surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw, on looking up, that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. Putting away the letter immediately and forcing a smile, she said, "I did not know before that you ever walked this way." "I have been making the tour of the park," he replied, "as I generally do every year, and intend to close it with a call at the parsonage. Are you going much farther?" "No, I should have turned in a moment." And accordingly she did, and they walked towards the parsonage together. "Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday?" she said. "Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again. But I am at his disposal. He arranges the business just as he pleases. And if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he has at least pleasure in the greatest power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy." "He likes to have his own way very well," replied Colonel Fitzwilliam, "but so do we all. It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich and handsome and highly skilled in the ways of death. I speak from experience. A younger son, you know, must be accustomed to self-denial and dependence. In my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little of either. Now, seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you choose, or procuring anything you had a fancy for? These are but home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have a greater experience many hardships of that nature. But in matters of greater weight, I may suffer from want of money. Younger sons are required to serve in the king's army, as you know." "Yes, though I imagine, as an earl's son, that you have seen little of the front lines." "Quite the contrary, Miss Bennet." The colonel lifted one of his trousers legs and presented Elizabeth with the most unfortunate sight, for there was nothing but lead and hickory between his knees. "Oh, he's got a prosthetic leg," and the ground. Elizabeth had perceived a limp upon meeting him, but had presumed it the result of some slight injury or ill-breeding. That's mean. Oh, ill-bred. To interrupt a silence which might make him fancy her affected by the sight, she soon afterwards said, "I imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly for the sake of having someone at his disposal. I wonder he does not marry to secure a lasting convenience of that kind, but perhaps his sister does as well for the present, and, as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her. I mean that in the most respectable way, naturally, and not as a suggestion that there exists any impropriety between them. That's good. If there did," said Colonel Fitzwilliam, "it would be an impropriety that I would be equally guilty of, for I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy." "Are you indeed? And pray, what sort of guardians do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble?" As she spoke, she observed him looking at her earnestly, and the manner in which he immediately asked her why she supposed Miss Darcy likely to give them any uneasiness, convinced her that she had somehow or other got pretty near the truth. She directly replied, "You need not be frightened. I never heard of any harm of her, and I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She is a very great favourite with some ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say that you know them." "I know little of them. Their brother is a pleasant gentleman-like man. He is a great friend of Darcy's." "Oh, yes," said Elizabeth dryly. "Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and takes a prodigious care of him." "Care of him? Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care. From something that he told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture." "What is it you mean?" "It is a circumstance which Darcy could not wish to be generally known, but if it were to get round to the lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing." "Sir, I have beheld the ancient secrets of the Orient, and shall take them to my grave. Surely I can be trusted with one of Mr. Darcy's dalliances." "Spill the tea, bro." And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. This is a guy. Okay. And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars, and I only suspect it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of the last summer. Oh, damn. Is Mr. Darcy the reason, Jane? Oh, I thought it was the sister. But it's Mr. Darcy. Uh-oh. Did Mr. Darcy give you reasons for this interference? I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady. And what arts did he use to separate them? He did not talk to me of his own arts, said Fitzwilliam, smiling. He only told me what I have told you now. Elizabeth made no answer and walked on, her thirst for vengeance growing mightier with every step. After watching her a little, Fitzwilliam asked her why she was so thoughtful. I am thinking of what you've been telling me, she said. Your cousin's conduct does not suit my feelings. Why was he to be the judge? You were rather disposed to call his interference officious. I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to decide on propriety of his friend's inclination, or why, upon his own judgment alone, he was determined and direct in what manner his friend was to be happy. But, she continued, recollecting, composed, as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case. This is not unnatural to surmise, said Fitzwilliam, but it is a lessening of the honour of my cousin's triumph very sadly. This was spoken jestingly, but it appeared to her so just a picture of Mr. Darcy that she would not trust herself with an answer, and therefore, abruptly changing the conversation, talked on indifferent matters until they reached the parsonage. There, shut into her own room, as soon as the visitor left them, she could think, without interruption, of all that she had heard. It was not to be supposed that any other could be meant than those with whom she was connected. There could not exist in the world two men over whom Mr. Darcy could have had such boundless influence. That he had been concerned in the measures taken to separate Bingley and Jane, she had never doubted, but she had always attributed to Miss Bingley the principal design and arrangement of them. If his own vanity, however, did not mislead him, he was the cause. His pride and caprice were the cause of all that Jane had suffered, and still continued to suffer. He had ruined for a while every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world, and for that Elizabeth was now resolved to hold Darcy's heart still beating in her hand before her time in Kent was concluded. Oh boy. There were some very strong objections against the lady, were Colonel Fitzwilliam's words, and those strong objections probably were her having one uncle who was a country attorney, another who was in a business in London, and possessing the power to crush Bingley's skull in the heat of a quarrel, for he was not trained as she. To Jane herself, she explained, there could be no possibility of objection. All loveliness and goodness as she, her understanding excellent, her musketry unmatched, and her manners captivating. Neither could anything be urged against my father, who, though with some peculiarities, has ability Mr. Darcy himself need not disdain, and respectably which he will probably never reach. When she thought of her mother, her confidence gave way a little, but she would not allow that any objections, though there had material weight, with Mr. Darcy, whose pride she was convinced would receive a deeper wound from the want of importance in his friend's connections than from the want of sense, and she thought it was quite decided at last that he had been partly governed by this worst kind of pride, and partly by the wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister. The agitation which the subject occasioned brought on a headache, and it grew so much worse toward the evening that, added to her unwillingness to kill Mr. Darcy in the company of his aunt, lest she interfere, it determined her not to attend her cousins to Rosings, where they were engaged to drink tea. She's like, no, I don't want to go with you. You suck. Alrighty, so the next chapter is a little bit long, so I think I'm just going to end this here for the day. We're almost on page 150. It's actually 147. If I keep reading like this, I could get there by Halloween, finishing this book on Halloween day. But I work all those days, so we'll see what happens. Was it just anyways, thank you for joining me. Remember to subscribe for more Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and then books later. So, yes, my name is Mars. Thank you for joining me. Enjoy the spooky season. Hope you're getting ready for Halloween. 4 days away. I'm excited. I know. We're actually going to give out some full-size candy bars this year, so hopefully that's we get a lot of trick-or-treaters. But anyways, beyond the point. Thank you again. Remember to subscribe. More book on its way. Peace.